here at the BC Support Unit offices on West Broadway. I'm responsible for training and capacity development, and today we are holding our second journal club, being led this time by the lead of our real-world clinical trials methods cluster, Hubert Wong, and I'm just about to share my screen so you can see our slide deck. Give me 1 second here. And Hubert, would you mind introducing yourself?
Right, okay, so I'm Hubert Wong. I'm the lead of the Real World Clinical Trials Methods Cluster here at the Support Unit. And the sort of mandate of our methods cluster is to develop new methods for doing real world clinical trials. I'm also a faculty member at the School of Population and Public Health at UBC, and I'm down at St. Paul's Hospital at the Center for Health Evaluation and Outcome Sciences.
Great, thanks, Hubert. So I just want to point out that the mic is here, and I just want to check to make sure. If you can't hear Hubert, can you let us know now by voice? Okay. Would you mind moving closer to the mic and speaking up? And do another sound test. Could you just, it doesn't move. Could you try speaking again?
Hello, can anyone not hear me now?
Okay, seeing no negative feedback, I'm just going to interrupt just for a second to do a quick acknowledgement. I want to begin the webinar by acknowledging the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations from whose traditional lands we're leading this meeting today. So we're acknowledging our territory and happy to be hosted by our Indigenous colleagues. So with that, I think we'll get underway. Hubert, if you're ready.
Sure.
Okay, then let's go.
All right, so I include a slide of disclosures and disclaimers, similar to what Linda did last week. And my first one is the same as hers. I'm not an expert in these sorts of designs. I am interested in learning more about how we should use these designs properly in real-world trials. And I am interested in hearing from people who are also interested in doing the same. Right, so yeah, this is just to let people know who might not have been here last week. The recording from last week is available, and this is the link to get to it. Now, one of the things that was sort of the main topic of last week's Journal Club was just for us to try and understand what are hybrid designs and what are the different types of them. And so the paper that was discussed last week was Curran from 2012, and he set out a typology for describing 3 different types of hybrid designs. In type 1, the objective is to test a clinical intervention for effectiveness while collecting information about its delivery and potential for implementation. The type 2 design is one where you're trying to test both the effectiveness of the intervention, but also to evaluate the implementation strategy itself. And the third type is when you're focusing on the outcomes of the implementation strategy and the evaluation of the effectiveness of the intervention is secondary. Okay. And so at the end of last week, we just decided that we would choose one paper to discuss this week. And when I went to look at these papers, I thought, well, we should probably aim for something that's type 2 or type 3. And so I ended up picking up one which claims to be a type 2. Though when I started reading it, I started getting a little bit confused. And I started wondering whether or not these 3 descriptions are actually the best way of describing the different types of designs, or whether we should even be trying to typify these designs. There was some discussion about that last week where some people were thinking that, well, maybe this is not really the best way of thinking about things, and that a lot of situations will not fall exactly within one of these 3 types. And so I will start off by describing sort of what were the key features in this paper that was selected for this week, and sort of say why it is that I'm uneasy about calling it a type 2 design. So This is just the header from that study. It's by Pelletier and others. And it's the implementation of a computer-assisted intervention for autism in schools, a hybrid type 2 cluster randomized effectiveness implementation trial. Next slide. Right, and so as you can tell from the title, the purpose of this study is to determine the impact of implementing a computer-assisted intervention, so a learning aid for students with autism in schools. And the study design is described as a cluster randomized trial. I think most people are fairly familiar with this type of design. Here, the individual students are not being randomized. Instead, their teachers are being randomized to receiving the intervention or not. And then all students who are being taught by that teacher will either receive or not receive the intervention based on the teacher's allocation. And so in this case, all of the teachers initially are trained to receive, will receive training in evidence-based practices for autism. And in this paper, there was a description of what these practices were. And then following that, half of these teachers would then be randomized to receive additional training and access to this computerized intervention called Teachtown Basics. And so what it is that the idea here is that this is a software app that that students can log into and receive some interventions through this app. And the idea here is that hopefully this could also allow teachers to be more efficient, to free up their time to do other things. And the main effectiveness outcome is the cognitive gain measured in each student and assessed by this tool called the DAS2. In terms of the implementation, what the researchers are interested in is to what extent is Teachtown being adopted by the teachers, so that's the penetration, and it's measured using logs directly from the software, and the fidelity, which is measured by direct observation by the coaches on how the teachers perform. And so it's key to note that these outcomes are measured at the teacher level, not at the student level. And so they call this a type 2 design. And I started wondering, well, how is this a type 2 design? Because as I read it, I thought, well, isn't this just like a type 1 design? I mean, they're trying to measure the impact on student cognition as sort of the effectiveness outcome. And they're just sort of measuring aspects of the implementation. And if you go back to the definition of type 1 design, well, this seems to fit that as well. Okay. And so, I think one of the things here is that when we talk about implementation, here there's a single implementation. And so you're not really comparing two different implementations. And so that's where I get uneasy about, well, what do we mean by evaluating the implementation? Are you actually trying to make statements about one implementation being better than another implementation, or are you just observing the results for one single implementation? And this becomes quite important when you start getting into things like sample size calculations. And so that was raised as a question at the last week's talk as to, well, how do we do sample size calculations for these types of studies? And I think that this is a key distinction. You know, are you actually trying to compare different implementations? Okay. And so I don't know. I think I'd actually sort of like to open it up for discussion here, because I don't know that I have a whole lot to say about this until we have an understanding of whether other people are struggling with this.
So that's an invitation to unmute yourself and chime in and let us know what you think.
I wonder, is Linda online?
Linda, are you here?
I am.
So, I mean, just as a way of like following on from last week, and I thought it might be helpful to get Linda's perspective on this, but, you know, and then.
And for those of you who don't know, you're hearing Sterling Bryan, the Scientific Director of the VC Support Unit. Linda?
I thank you. Hubert, I completely agree with you. When I was reading the paper, I was, you know, I kind of, you know, sit back a little bit and thought, that's not a type 2. But, you know, I guess you know, I'm going to preface by saying that I think we're still at the early stage of using these type of designs. So people are still trying to, you know, make sense of what the different typologies really stand. So I went back to Implementation Science, which was the journal that published this article, because usually they have the peer review. You know, and I just wanted to see the comments, because part of it I wasn't quite understand was that usually the reviewers will ask them to describe why it is a type 2, you know. So my sense is that, I mean, there was very little written in the peer review, but my sense is that they originally said that it's a hybrid design. They didn't say type 1, 2, or 3. And I think one of the reviewers may have said that, just put type 2. And so it becomes a type 2, but in the article there was no explanation why it is a type 2, and it doesn't make sense to me that, you know, if type 2 is for evaluating the effect of the clinical intervention as well as the implementation intervention, where is the evaluation of the implementation intervention and the outcome? I mean, the only way I could guess what the reasoning would be that the evaluation of the implementation intervention is a one-group design. So there's no randomization of which type of implementation that they're testing, but it's just that one way that they're implementing it, and they're looking at fidelity and process outcomes. But then I question why it is not a type 1 hybrid design, like which is what type 1 is supposed to do. So it raised more questions to me than answer, I guess.
So can I just like follow up on that? Because I mean, you know, as soon as we hadn't had the conversation about this, and that was like exactly my point. There was that very point as well. I didn't see what was. So if they had a comparative evaluation of implementation interventions, then that would have then sort of taken this from type 1 to type 2. Is that what you're both saying?
That's what I thought. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, clearly that was the case. I guess my uncertainty just goes back to sort of the way they've defined type 1, type 2, type 3, and whether it's actually clear what it is needed to go from type 1 to type 2. You know, does it have to have a comparison of implementations, or does it not?
Right. Okay. I think someone actually, there was a chat.
Does anyone have any other thoughts about this discussion? One person is saying, isn't that what AIM 2 is about, teacher implementation?
Right, but AIM 2 is about fidelity. Right, so that's more of, I guess, so I'm just wondering, how is it different from how we describe a type 1 design, that we're just looking at fidelity?
Maybe we should go back and look at the slide that shows the 3 types. There we go.
Yeah. So it's certainly like I think it works very nicely as a type 1 then, because the fidelity piece is not comparative. So you're sort of gathering information that gives you some indication about, like, you know, how well this implementation is working, but you're not able to say anything comparative. Is this a better way of implementing compared to something else? So I think that's fundamentally why it falls into type 1 rather than type 2 in my mind.
Tanya, you've raised your hand. Great, we can't hear you. If you're muted, could you unmute yourself on your computer?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, great.
Okay. I know absolutely nothing about hybrid designs, but I'll take a guess from like simulation modeling point of view. And it seems to me, because in this intervention specifically, it sounds like the level of uptake of the intervention will also change the clinical effectiveness. And then they need to be tested simultaneously. It's not just an assumption that whatever penetration levels the teachers have it, we assume the same effectiveness, the same efficacy values for the intervention. So that's why I think the hybrid type 2 is appropriate, but it's just my guess.
Others' thoughts? Thanks, Tanya.
What's quite interesting is that they actually separate out the analysis approach for analyzing the effectiveness data from AIM-1 and the implementation data from AIM-2. Because I think I think your point's an interesting point, Tanya, that like you're sort of saying that these two are actually like highly, that you can't actually separate them out, that the implementation is going to have a big impact on the overall effectiveness. But if that's the case, then you would actually want them to be analyzing those things together rather than separating them out. Whereas what they talk about in their protocol is that how they'll analyze the effectiveness data, which is, if I understood it correctly, independent of the implementation data. Did I get that right?
Yeah, it's almost like thinking about this as adherence.
Adherence, yeah.
Any other thoughts around this? What do you think, Hubert? Should we express on?
We could, although I'm just wondering if people have an idea of like, if we're saying, well, maybe we're still not entirely sure whether this is type 1 or type 2, and I guess the question is, you know, how might this have been designed that would clearly put it in one group or the other group?
That's a good question. Does anybody have any thoughts about that?
I mean, I suppose a further sort of like reflection on that question is, you know, does it matter? You know, I sort of being clear about the question matters, but whether it fits into a neat category, does that matter? I mean, I suppose like the challenge is like, is this categorization helpful or not? Is part of what I guess you were trying to get us to reflect upon.
Yeah, that was another aspect of it. Yeah. Rick here. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi. Oh. We can see both you and Lara. Hi.
Oh yeah. Yes, Lara joined me here. Yeah, I think it follows up really well on our discussion last week, thinking that, you know, of kind of hypothetical things, these different types might be worth thinking about, and I think we ended last week with a very important question about, you know, what is actually the hybrid, what does that actually refer to, what is being combined here, are they different objectives or different methods or different designs, and so I think that's partly leading to the confusion. But I agree with your comment, Sterling, or your question about, you know, is it really useful to actually really situate each study within a particular box, or is this, do we just simply need to look at the objectives of the study and figure out are the methodological approaches, are they consistent with that? But I still have some questions about, you know, what these hybrid designs actually are. Are they
like a hybridity of designs, a hybridity of methods, a hybridity of if that's even a word, I don't know, but of aims or outcomes. Like, I'm not quite sure.
Well, let's continue the theme on hybridity. I love that. So
introduce a new word.
I think that's perfect. I think we need to have that reflection. Like, what is the hybrid piece, which is where we were. So the conversation was moving last week. Yeah. So is it?
Here's some hands.
All right. Oh, we've got hands.
Shimei? I'm afraid we can't hear you. Can you unmute yourself on your computer?
Still can't hear you, I'm afraid. Maybe if you want to type it into the box, then we can. That might be.
Tanya, you still have your hand raised. Were you wanting to chime in, or was that? Yeah.
So Linda's raised her hand.
Linda, please.
Thank you. So I think Rick raised a really good question. I struggle about it as well. I think from the field of KT and implementation science, the typology is important. It gives us a common language to think about how to, sort of do research that can, sort of speed up the production of new knowledge that, in terms of, be able to study the clinical outcome as well as the implementation outcome around the same time, and it gives us a way to communicate. So the thing is that, if we write a grant and be able to communicate that, within people in, the implementation science field, that's important. Now, whether it is important to fit everything into a box all the time, I don't think so. I mean, the example that I was given last time that, when I was sending the project grant, I said it's a type 1. 3 reviewers said great, 2 reviewers said, I don't know why you will use that. And, when we took out the typology, we got the grant. So, I mean, that just, give the example that, sometimes it's just not important to fit things in the box, but I guess it depends on which review panel you're submitting a grant to. And the more we understand it, the more advantage that we have, when we're applying for funding.
Thanks, Linda. I wonder if you would lower your hand. And Shimei, did you decide you didn't want to chime in using the chat function? Your hand is still raised. Any other thoughts?
Can I throw in another thought? I wonder if it's worthwhile to maybe send an invitation to Jeff Curran and see whether he wants to come and do one of the journal topics so he can explain what a type 2 is or a type 3.
That's a good idea. We should definitely try and do that. Let me put a sort of question out there then that sort of indicate, if this is not a type 2, and it is more likely to be a type 1, but could have been a type 2 if they'd introduced some comparative piece on the implementation side as well as the intervention side. I mean, how would you simultaneously analyze those comparative pieces, I guess? Because that's what a type 2 is then trying to do. It's actually like saying that the analysis can't ignore the effectiveness side and just analyze the intervention side. There is potentially interaction between those two. If you've got an implementation intervention that's working really well, but for something that really doesn't work very well, you actually want to know that, and vice versa. So is it about just like dealing effectively with interactions in the analysis of your trial that actually that then like facilitates the type 2? I guess I'm looking at Hubert.
And I don't have an answer.
Because I put on my Twitter thing like for last week, are they too good to be true? That was my question. Like, you know, is this actually just too good to be true that you can actually deal with all of this stuff simultaneously, and you know, rather than actually like, you know, doing it in a thoughtful, sequential way, I suppose. Which, well, I mean, like, I'm not saying this is not thoughtful, but at least it is sequential. You know, it's not sequential. That's the key difference, isn't it?
I mean, I guess if you had two different possible implementations, then you'd sort of have to have like a three-arm trial then.
Yes.
Right. And so if you found that there was no difference in effectiveness for the two implementations, then you might just combine them and say, well, let's compare that to the control to assess the effectiveness. But if the effectiveness then differed between the two implementations, then I don't think there's no sort of simplification. You simply have, you know, essentially, you know, two different measures of effectiveness, which are dependent on which implementation you use.
Yeah. Eric is typing away. I don't know whether he's typing into the chat box.
Yeah, hi. I was actually wanting to respond to an earlier question, but just on that immediate comment, my thought is that the mediating variable would be fidelity. So, like, if one implementation strategy led to, you know, less than acceptable fidelity, then you know, that's an issue that needs to be thought through carefully. So yeah, but in the trial I was involved in, the at-home Chez Soi trial, we do a fidelity evaluation along with your outcome evaluation, your effectiveness evaluation, and then there's a consensus in the field that, you know, above a certain level of fidelity is considered good implementation or acceptable implementation. So if you have less than good implementation, that's not a fair test of your outcome. So yeah,
that's great. So did you then factor that differential fidelity? So presumably you had places where the fidelity was strong and other places where it was less strong. Did you factor that into the analysis of the overall effectiveness of the intervention?
Well, all of them reached, there was variability, but all of them reached, you know, the point that would be considered acceptable fidelity. So we thankfully didn't have to deal with that issue. But like what we did do was, once the cross, you know, was a multi-site RCT, and once the you know, the cross-site results came out, then there was another analysis looking at the correlation between fidelity and outcomes, and then which you know, there's the fidelity scale had 5 components, and so it was just that was the analysis having to do with, you know, how exactly fidelity does contribute, like which components contribute to outcome. I'm probably not explaining that perfectly well, but that's what we did in that case.
No, that's very clear. So then you were able to establish that actually fidelity mattered in terms of outcomes.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, exactly.
So we have Rick's hand up and Piper's hand up. Rick, you were first, please.
Oh, right. Well, I think in some ways I have 2 questions, basically. One that relates to the discussion we just had. That sounds to me like almost a distinction between intention to treat analysis versus a per protocol analysis, where you're bringing the intervention fidelity into your analytical plan as per protocol type of analysis. It's just not with a binary whether the protocol happened or not, but more with respect to the extent to which it was implemented. But the other question, what's leading me to confusion in Curran's article, and I think it would be a very good idea to have him come talk, is when I read in table 3 of his article about type 2, it's about determining feasibility and potential utility. That, to me, doesn't necessarily imply a comparative test. But then when we read further in the text, then there's the use of the language of testing. So to me, it's not actually quite clear whether the implementation aspect actually requires a comparative evaluation on another group per se, and that's confusing to me, and that would kind of determine as to whether this article fits in with a hybrid type 2 or not.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks, Rick. And Piper, please. We're not able to hear you, Piper. Are you muted on your computer? We've had reported in our office here that the raise hand function isn't working for everyone. So if you do want to chime in and you are not able to raise your hand, go ahead and use your voice and let us know what you have to say.
I think Alison wanted to come in. So, I mean, maybe Piper, if you want to just type in the chat box, then you can get your question to us or comment through that. Maybe we go to Alison then.
Just check with Piper one more time. She was playing with some things there. Piper, want to try your voice one more time?
You hear me now?
Yeah. No, I'm afraid we can't hear you. Sorry. So maybe try the chat box. And Alison, please.
My question was more linked to what Tanya had shared before, and if the group was able to provide some clarity around the distinction between fidelity versus, I'm trying to remember what the term that Tanya used in comparison to fidelity. I'm sorry, I've been trying to get my hand raise and speaker function working, so I'm distracted.
Maybe we start with just defining what we mean by fidelity.
So my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that fidelity is classically used with application of the intervention. How closely did the intervention follow all the parameters that should be applied for that specific intervention? The frequency, the intensity, the duration, those kinds of things. I guess what I'm seeking for my question is was that what Tanya was referring to? Or was she referring to something different than those elements of fidelity to the implementation?
Tanya?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
I think I understood not fidelity in this case, similar to adherence. Like, for example, if you think of a drug adherence, the more the patient uses, the more clinical effectiveness you observe. And here, the more the teachers use the functionalities of this tool, then you'll see a bigger effect of the intervention as well. To me, it's the same as adherence.
Okay, thank you, Tanya. That's helpful. I was wondering if you were using adherence in the same way as fidelity. Linda, I'm interested from a KT perspective. Is there a distinction between the use of those terms, and then does that have implications on how we might categorize these types of designs?
Thank you, Alison. I don't know if there's any specific distinction within the KT implementation science field, but I guess if you're looking at a clinical intervention, fidelity would, be, all-encompassing about how the intervention is being delivered, used by all parties involved. Adherence, from my world, looking at patient self-management, for example, adherence is how much the patient participant themselves in following the specific things that are given to them to follow, and perhaps not so much of how it's being used to describe, how, let's say a physician is involved, how the physician is giving the intervention. So I don't know if that explanation is helpful, but that's sort of the way that I would use those terms. I wouldn't use them interchangeably unless if I'm talking about, unless if the intervention is specifically rely on the patient participant to execute.
Right, that's very helpful. So I think what I'm hearing from you is that although there's some overlap between those terms, adherence is more about the user fidelity, how the user is using it, are they adhering to it the way that it is prescribed, versus fidelity meaning is it being delivered in the manner that it was intended. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's right.
Okay.
And Piper, I see you've raised your hand again. Does that mean you found some unmuting?
Yeah, can you hear me now? I'm calling in.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So joining this discussion as a computer scientist rather than a health scientist by background, I think my perspective might be a little bit different because especially because this is something that is being used by teachers in a classroom. Fidelity, I mean, it's not a medical, it's not like medicine adherence as was mentioned before, in the sense that it's being used creatively, and in some cases low fidelity might be appropriate, particularly when you're dealing with children with autism who have quite varied needs and issues. And so I was quite impressed that they included qualitative and mixed methods analysis, speaking with the teachers, particularly they say to help explain counterintuitive findings, right? That low fidelity might be a good thing or a bad thing, and it might depend on the particular context that this intervention is being used. And the reason why I mentioned being a computer scientist is because that kind of qualitative data for looking at how a technology is being used is extremely useful, rather than, for understanding the system's behavior in the real world. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that's, that would be, sorry.
Yeah, for me that makes perfect sense, and I really like the idea of doing mixed methods work in this area so that you can understand something about why, not just whether, but why the implementation is successful or not, and what might be areas to make change. I guess my concern is whether you can do that simultaneously with measuring effectiveness or establishing effectiveness. That's my, so I go back to this, is the whole thing just too good to be true? Because if you've got this qualitative data that then speaks to the fact that this is not ideal from an implementation point of view, so you make change and you do something different, but you're at the same time collecting your effectiveness data in the context of a trial of effectiveness, if that implementation matters, then should you be just pooling everything and using all of the data to establish effectiveness when you've made what is potentially quite a big change in the way it's being implemented?
Rick, your hand is still raised. Is that an earlier one?
Piper wants to come back on that.
Piper, are you wanting to chime in?
Yeah, just a quick response to Sterling. I think that it might have something to do with the nature of this intervention, right? That excuse me, that if you're working with kids with autism, often the choice of how much fidelity you have to the originally planned intervention might not be yours, right? That you might have to adapt a lot to the individuals that you're working with.
Sure. Yeah.
Thanks, Piper. Other thoughts?
Yeah, it's Eric here. It has to, well, when it comes to complex interventions, like complex community interventions, the notion of fidelity is a bit more lenient, as it has less to do whether you're kind of slavishly following all the operational details compared to whether you're following underlying principles. So in the context of autism, like being, I think it was, I forget who it was talking about being, I guess Piper was talking about being creative in that context, meaning that you're not necessarily going to implement with fidelity. Well, the literature on fidelity and complex interventions would say that's okay. It's like you still would be considered to be, using high fidelity practice when you look, you just need to measure it differently. So, and if you're measuring at the level of principle as opposed to like whatever the manual sort of dictates, then you would be considered using high fidelity practice. Anyway, there's arguments back and forth, but that's the kind of, I think that's the more current understanding of what fidelity is.
Other thoughts?
So can I take us to sample size? So we did have this question on sample size calculations, like being complex in this space, and like, how might you even begin to think about sample size calculations? Is that something that we want to have some discussion on?
Well, I can kick it off with just a very brief discussion of what they did in this paper.
You want to move on to the slides?
Yeah, we can move.
We're just going to move to slides. Sorry, making you all dizzy.
It's the back one, yeah. So and this is actually going to come back again to this question of, are we actually evaluating a single implementation, or are we actually comparing different implementations? Because in this particular paper, they did do sample size calculations, and the first one they did was for the effectiveness. Okay, so analyzing these cognitive score changes, and I think that calculation was actually fairly standard, for a cluster randomized trial, and I was able to more or less replicate what they did. But then they went on and started reporting these sample size calculations for these implementation outcomes, and to be honest, I haven't a clue what they're doing. It's like, if you only have one implementation, how can you be comparing it to something? And because that's what a sample size calculation is meant to do, is to say, well, how many do you need in order to compare? So I got really confused when they did that. Now, if you compare that to one of the other papers, which is on the resource list by Mello, they only have one implementation, but the outcome measure they're using is something that you can measure for both arms. And so it's not that you can't do a sample size calculation if you only have one implementation, but it has to be on a measure that you can observe in both arms. And in this study, well, there's no such thing as penetration or fidelity in the control arm. They're not receiving this intervention or this implementation. So I think when we start talking about sample size, we have to first sort of figure out, well, really, what's the question?
Yeah. I mean, it seems like an obvious sort of place to find ourselves, which is thinking about exactly what the question is. But you're right. I mean, I think you can't sensibly take anything forward by way of sample size unless you've got complete clarity on exactly what the question is that you're trying to address. I think it does speak to this sort of separation, like they've separated out the effectiveness analysis and the sample size required for that from the implementation evaluation. And like, yeah, the sample size calculation is rather opaque or confusing or not clear. Choose whichever one you want to put into your assessment. Okay.
Any thoughts on sample size from the room?
Mohsen here. Just a quick question, maybe from Hubert. If we cannot priori specify sample size, can we have, for example, stopping rules? I think something is required, right? It cannot be a completely lawless land. Maybe some form of a stopping rule. I think this falls into the realm of like adaptive clinical trials, right? Like one of this adaptiveness part of it is like you stop when you reach a certain level of confidence with your effect size. I was just thinking, just throwing it out there, maybe it's applicable in this particular context too.
Yeah. I mean, I think the issue here is that, again, are you talking about the effectiveness or the implementation outcomes? So for the effectiveness, it wasn't an issue, but I guess the question is, how do you even frame the implementation outcome as a question that is actually comparative? And I mean, it's okay to say that we'll just keep on, collecting more data and stop at some point, but the question is, what's the criteria that you're trying to hit?
Yeah, fair enough.
Other thoughts from others?
If I can put Linda on the spot again. I know at the end of last session, Linda said that she had encountered situations before where it was unclear what to do for a sample size calculation. And so I guess I want to ask her, what was that situation and why was it difficult?
The proposal that we put in for review is actually type 3 hybrid design. So we were essentially doing something different. We were testing implementation intervention and collecting clinical data at the same time. But I guess what's parallel with the current discussion is that you have two different interventions that we're testing at the same time. Even if we're saying that there is one takes priority compared to the other one, so implementation intervention takes priority, I still have to figure out what to do in terms of the sample size to test the clinical intervention. So I never thought of the idea of whether it's too good to be true, but I think, Sterling raised some really good question that, how we, reconcile all the needs in terms of, testing different types of intervention in the same trial. So that's where, my challenges come from. And yes, I will knock on your door, Hubert, when it comes point to we need to do sample size calculation.
So I think Eric, was it Eric?
I had a thought might be back to an earlier discussion, but it is to the question of like what would be a meaningful comparison. If one were to design a study that compared different approaches to implementation strategy, it seems to me like there's a, I don't know if you'd call it a weakness in this study, is that they're using this hypothesis, like they are trying to understand implementation through this lens of their organizational change plan behavior theoretical lens, which drives their drives our hypothesis, different hypotheses about, what they expect to impact on uptake and implementation. But it seems to me that they have an underlying hypothesis that the teachers that see TeachTown as complementary to the other evidence-based practices will use it, and the ones that see it as interfering won't. And it seems like that they could do a comparison. They could develop two implementation strategies. One which was just to, as they seem to be doing, is just explaining this is TeachTown, this is how it works, this is how you implement it. And another one which is driven by the complementarity notion that, that delivers the message that here's TeachTown, it's going to, it's not going to interfere with your other evidence-based practices, and this is how the two, this is how these two things work together. Like, to me, that kind of thing would be a meaningful comparison, and might be worthy of study. And what they're proposing what they're proposing to study in terms of these determinants of implementation uptake they don't really get you any further, other than to potentially validate these hypotheses that they've set out there. That instead of just using that knowledge to design an implementation strategy that makes some sense.
Okay. Yeah.
Thanks, Eric. We've got a comment from Sinead who couldn't be heard via audio, and this is unfortunately from a half an hour ago. My apologies, I didn't see your chat until just now. And your comment is, I have a question. In our current project, as part of the evaluation process, we are also evaluating the feasibility and accessibility of the intervention. Could it be considered as evaluating the implementation strategy and considered as hybrid type 2? You also talked adherence, that's another aspect. So a question to the room at large, I guess.
I think obviously, it's difficult to give definitive advice at this point, but I would think that if you are simultaneously evaluating outcomes and the implementation strategy, then that would be most likely to be a type 2 design.
We've just got 4 minutes left. Is there any other heady topic we would like to dissect in the remaining 4 minutes?
I think that's going to be impossible.
a little facetious.
Just some reflections, and I don't know whether, maybe I'll go first, and then Linda and Hubert could also just give some reflections on sort of where we've got to. I'm thinking, in my mind, I'm thinking where we see interaction, this really matters in terms of interaction between the intervention itself and the implementation strategy. So if we really expect the implementation strategy to have a big impact on the outcomes that we see, then we want to be evaluating that and probably trying to do that simultaneously in something like a type 2 design would be good. But where we don't expect that interaction to be in play, then actually keeping these things separate probably doesn't matter too much. So in fact, I think then, we want to establish that this really works and improves things before we actually decide how we're going to implement. And we can do that sequentially rather than simultaneously. And then the other thought that's on my mind is, where does the cost piece come in here? We should be thinking about the cost of implementation. Maybe that's actually going to be one of the big pieces where we see different implementation strategies being quite different in the cost side as well as the effectiveness side. And so in fact, we should be thinking about hybrid effectiveness, cost effectiveness, and implementation designs. So there we are. Those are my thoughts. Hubert, Linda?
Hubert's collecting his thoughts.
I don't have much to add beyond what I've already said today. I think there's been some good discussion here, and it's clear that there needs to be more for us to really figure out where we're trying to go with these. And I think Sterling's point is good in that, depending on the circumstance, it may or may not be appropriate to really shoot for, a very complex hybrid design. You might be able to get away using sort of more standard approaches if you felt that the implementation was not, as Sterling said, interacting with the clinical intervention.
Linda, any last comments in the last 60 seconds?
I guess, the whole idea of doing the hybrid design was the notion that, we should think about doing clinical health services type of research separately, that we used to focus on the clinical outcome before we do anything to even care about the implementation. So the hybrid design, started this discussion about how can we do them together and speed up the process. And so the intention is good, but methodologically, I think there's still a lot to work out. So I just want to say that I'm really grateful for this journal club, because it raised more questions than answer, but those are really good questions to think through.
Thanks, Linda. So we're at 1 o'clock. We need to wind up. There's another group coming in behind us. But as next steps, this recording will be up on our website within the next 48 hours. You'll find it under the Methods Clusters section of our website.
I'm just thinking that we should invite Karen. I think that is a next step, is a natural next step. But I think we should actually invite Karen to do a webinar for us. Yeah.
There we go. So there's the next step. We will undertake that piece as well. So stay tuned to your email inboxes for updates on Karen, as well as watch the newsletter for the link to the recording. And thank you, everyone, for your time today. Bidding you all very pleasant and hopefully cool afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Bye now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.